Hello, and welcome to this episode of Kitchen Pedagogy. And here I'm going to talk about the issue of being inclusive, being systematically inclusive. And actually, I think it's something which teachers need to think a lot more about because it's difficult and we often take shortcuts, we cut corners for pragmatic reasons. But I think often we need to do better. When you look at a classroom full of children, it's a pretty obvious thing to say that none of the children matter less than any of the others. I think that's uncontroversial. But often when you watch a lesson, through the eyes of the least successful student, the one who's struggling the most, the lesson just really isn't tailored for them. They're just always behind, always catching up, and very often just explicitly left out. And you can feel that a lesson is progressing more or less okay because the majority of students seem to be doing all right. But if we're being inclusive, we have to change our mindset around that. You have to think of the students who are least likely to be successful without you teaching directly to them, and think about whether or not you could include them more intentionally, more systematically. So there are a few things that you might consider. For example, when you ask a question, what does it take to answer a question? It requires thinking. Now, what are the students thinking with? Are they thinking with their prior knowledge? So you're assuming, for example, they can construct an explanation or solve a maths problem or compare a couple of sources or something, using knowledge they have about those materials, those concepts. But what if they don't have that knowledge? So you've asked a question to the room, and some of the children there can't participate because they don't know enough about it to begin with. And often they're blank page, there's nothing on the table, they're just relying on their knowledge, but it's not there, so they're just checking out. Now students in that situation just think, well, this isn't for me. I'm being asked about stuff I don't know, that I can't access, and they just become disengaged. They start feeling that they're on the fringe, and that becomes a whole mindset they have. Now if you're thinking about them and you were teaching it, you'd be thinking, let's say you're talking about Joey. Joey, how are you getting on? Joey explicitly struggles. What's he supposed to think with? Now maybe his prior knowledge is pretty weak. So maybe he needs a resource. Maybe he needs a stimulus, something to look at with information on it so that he can engage with something that's there and think using that information so that he's scaffolded to succeed in the task of thinking without relying on the knowledge he doesn't have. But that means you need to consider him in your planning and provide those resources and decide what those would be. That's an inclusive teaching approach. Otherwise, you're creating a culture where the students who already know the most, progress the most, have the most airtime, get the most practice, and the students who know the least are kind of just on the edge again and again and again. Another aspect of it might be when you introduce new concepts, you're building on what's there already. So you might say, let me explain a phenomenon, and you tell a story. It could be a story from history, or a phenomenon in geography, or looking at another piece of a text, say a Shakespeare play or something. Or explaining something that seems everyday, like why it rains or where snow comes from. And each time you introduce these ideas, you're relying on some prior knowledge. But what if the students who are struggling the most don't have that prior knowledge? They don't really know what's been going on so far in the play because they've lost the plot before. They don't really understand where all the countries are that you're referring to when you talk about the case study in geography. They don't really know the significance of Kathmandu when you talk about it. It sounds like a foreign place. They don't really relate it to the Himalayas and the rest of it. They don't have a schema for it already. And you're describing these situations as if that's just a given. You've got to unpick that. You've got to think, will Susanna, Joey, the children who are struggling, will they be able to follow this? What do I need to provide them with? And do some checking around those assumptions. And you have to do that pretty much all the time. Otherwise, they just fall away again. And once they don't know what's going on, they lose attention and they become disengaged. And it's just difficult. They become people who think of themselves as unsuccessful. So you scaffold for thinking, you scaffold for explanations, you do lots of prior knowledge checks. And another area might be something where you say, let's get everybody talking. And you think that's a good idea, which it often is, because all the children can then air their thoughts, rehearse ideas, and also flush out problems they're having. And they're more likely to say they're struggling when they do it together than putting their hand up and saying it on their own. But what if the pair talk really only involves, say, half the class, the dominant pair person in each pair? That's very easy to do that, and I see that a lot. Sometimes we've got 3s and 4s. Watch children in groups of 3 or 4 trying to have a conversation. Really, most of the thinking is done by one person in each group. Another person might chip in, and the extra people are just sort of hanging in there, often not really having to do very much at all. So if you want everyone to think and participate, you've got to be much more deliberate and intentional about the way you structure the pair talk. It's got to be certainly definitely pairs and not 3s. Maybe explicitly turn take, so partner A goes first, now partner B. And again, give them resources to refer to and think about in their discussion, so they're all able to participate and practice and use the language and develop some of the skills around that. And there are numerous other examples like this, where the feeling of the learning going okay on the surface because of the general level of participation being reasonably all right masks the fact that you might have 5, 8, 10 students in the class who are not thriving, but you don't notice them because of all the other children. If you're being genuinely inclusive, and it means more to you than just, yeah, I believe in inclusion, it's a kind of mantra for you. If it's something where you think, no, I need that to be a feature of my teaching, a characteristic of my classroom, that everyone is included in the learning, you have to think, right, is everybody included in the learning? Everyone means everybody. So you've got to do a mental check and think, are they able to think about this? Do they have the prior knowledge for this? Are they participating in the task? What scaffolds might they need? And a lot of this comes down to appropriate scaffolds, things they can use to give them a leg up and so they can participate in the conversation that other children can do without the scaffolds. That's the heart of inclusive teaching. So it's a tough thing to say. Don't just say that you believe in inclusion. Don't just say, yeah, of course I believe in equity and so on, unless it is a feature of your teaching. Because you're not an inclusive teacher unless you teach inclusively. And I think that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of soul searching. Watch a video of your own lesson. Spotlight a child who you know is struggling. What's it like for them to sit in your own class? Do you direct the learning such that they can thrive? Really have a hard think about it. And then that's a massively important conversation to have in your teams, because it's going to lead to you generating supporting resources that probably everyone will benefit from.